Good afternoon to everyone in Eastern and Central Time, and good morning to everyone in Mountain and Pacific. I'm so happy to have you here for today's webinar on the past, present, and future of moving youth away from the adult court. This is Josh Rovner of the Sentencing Project. I've worked with each of the other panelists on today's webinar on various issues, so I know they have compelling stories to tell about their successes and challenges. I hope that our listeners will learn about policy change beyond the passage of legislation and about the importance of implementation. Whatever the issue is that we're fighting for, that fight continues. And that's the most important thing I've learned in the past year or so, which is why I put this panel together. We're eager to hear from you, so please submit questions throughout the discussion by using the questions section on your GoToWebinar panel. We'll get to your questions after the presentations are finished, but you can submit them at any time during today's presentations. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our YouTube page for you to share with friends and family. It should be a great day. This really has been an exciting decade for juvenile justice reformers. When we discuss Raise the Age, it's really impossible to overstate the role that our friends at the Campaign for Youth Justice have played on this issue. The Raise the Age campaigns have had concrete results that have helped thousands of young people, many of them not so young anymore, by helping keep them out of the adult criminal justice system. If you're new to this issue, I encourage you to visit their website and learn more, especially through their recent report, Raising the Bar, which highlights the last 3 years of successes. And here's the panel we have with us today. I'm Josh Rovner, the Juvenile Justice Advocacy Associate at the Sentencing Project. Then we'll hear from Jason Smith, the Juvenile Justice Policy Associate at the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. Tracy Tucker is the Raise the Age South Carolina Coordinator at the Campaign for Youth Justice. And Abby Anderson is the Executive Director at the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. Here's why I'm so excited about this particular set of leaders. First, we have a really nice balance of people from a blue state, a purple state, and a red state. I think each of their successes and challenges shows the salience of this issue for legislators all over the country. Keeping more teenagers away from the adult courts is a mainstream, moderate, and common sense issue, and today's panel proves it. So let me turn to the order of our speakers. Michigan is one of the 5 states that has yet to pass Raise the Age legislation, meaning that 17-year-olds are still routinely charged there as if they're adults. Legislation has been moving there for years, so Jason Smith will talk about the barriers to getting it passed. Next, we'll turn to Tracy Tucker in South Carolina. South Carolina passed Raise the Age legislation just last year, but is now in a transition period of making sure that law gets implemented. As of today, 17-year-olds are charged as adults in South Carolina, and the implementation is scheduled for July of 2019. Jason and Tracy are both alumni of the National Juvenile Justice Network's Youth Justice Leadership Institute. And if you're looking for advocacy opportunities in your state, NJN's website is a good place to find local organizations with whom to partner. Our last speaker will be Abby Anderson, the Executive Director of the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. A decade ago, Connecticut was one of 13 states that treated 17-year-olds as if they were adults, and one of 3 states that also treated 16-year-olds as if they were adults. Connecticut now has years of experience with the transformation, and Abby is going to talk about the impact of having raised the age and where she sees her state moving next. So let's keep going. Right there on screen, that's me. I'm Josh Rovner, Juvenile Justice Advocacy Associate at the Sentencing Project, where I've worked since 2014. I manage a portfolio of issues, including juveniles sentenced to life without parole, transfer of juveniles into the adult criminal justice system, and racial and ethnic disparities in juvenile justice. I've previously worked on youth development issues such as access to primary and mental health care, tobacco prevention, and comprehensive health education. You know, after sending out the invitation to this webinar, I got emails from people asking why we didn't include some other amazing panelists to join us. And let me just say, based on the list that I was getting, you're absolutely right. And I hope during the Q&A portion, I'll hear from some other states about the successes and challenges you've had in your campaigns. So This map shows where we were a decade ago. 3 states, Connecticut, New York, and North Carolina, routinely charged 16 and 17-year-olds as if they were adults. 10 more states, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri, routinely charged 17-year-olds as if they were adults. Now, it's important to understand that there are other pathways into the adult courts. Even if a young person is below the age of adult criminal responsibility, they can be and often are transferred into the adult courts. Last December, I wrote a report titled How Tough on Crime Became Tough on Kids, Prosecuting Teenage Drug Charges in Adult Courts. It's available on our website, and it showed how transfer laws are so wide-ranging that all but 4 states allow young people to be transferred into the adult system, even on drug charges. It's a reminder that even as we reach a point where all 17-year-olds are routinely charged as the youth that they are, closing the transfer pathways is a necessary reform as well. Yet, here we are a decade later. By 2016, as we'll discuss, Connecticut no longer charged 16 and 17-year-olds as if they were adults. And by 2016, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Illinois were also no longer charging 17-year-olds as adults. And in 2017, New York, South Carolina, Louisiana, and North Carolina all passed raise the age laws. Yet it's important to realize that the implementation of these laws was not instantaneous. Louisiana has a 2-part implementation, with some youth impacted in July 2018 and others in July 2020. South Carolina's law is effective in July 2019. North Carolina's law won't be implemented until December 2019. And New York raised the age to 17 in October 2018 and to 18 a year later. So this is where I'll hand off the story. And we'll start with Jason Smith, who will tell us about the challenges in getting a bill passed in Michigan. Jason leads legislative advocacy efforts at the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency and serves as the coordinator of the campaign to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction in Michigan. Additionally, Jason is responsible for managing several of MCCD's projects that aim to reduce the use of out-of-home placement throughout the statewide expansion of effective community-based programming for justice-involved youth. So here he is, Jason.
Hi, apologies. I couldn't get off mute for a second. Thank you, Josh, and thank you everybody who's participating today. So I'll give a quick background overview of what's happened with the legislation so far to raise the age here in Michigan, some of the current barriers that we have, and what's happening to try to overcome those barriers. So this first slide shows the overview of the raise the age. Whoops, excuse me. The Raise the Age bill package. You can see that there's a range of issues addressing youth, the issue of youth in the adult system here in Michigan in the bill package. I didn't, for sake of time, include descriptions for each bill or the bill numbers or who the sponsors are. You can see that in full on the Raise the Age campaign website, raiseagemi.org. But it's important to know that these bills were sponsored by a bipartisan group of House members here in the state legislature, Republican-led. And while it covers a range of issues, the top 3 generally garner the most conversation around the state and actually pose the most barriers to passing the legislation. So raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction from 17 to 18, coming up with some sort of funding solution to support the juvenile justice system and incorporating this new population into their jurisdiction, and then prohibiting the placement of all young people under the age of 18 in adult jails or prisons, whether or not they are prosecuted as adults. So last session, the bills sailed through the House Criminal Justice Committee pretty easily. The folks you see there in that picture there are a number of the bill sponsors. The guy at the microphone is Harvey Santana, who was really our legislative champion, who's been term limited out, but I believe the bulk of those folks are still there. But the Criminal Justice Committee was, most of the bill sponsors were actually committee members, so we passed, the bills passed through that committee pretty easily, and then passed the House with huge bipartisan support, huge majority, with 85% of House members voting in support of the legislation. During the legislative hearings, both in the House and the Senate, all of the stakeholders groups that testified on the bills, whether they represented state or local or government interests, testified that they supported the concept of raise the age. They supported the idea that 17-year-olds should be considered youth, that the current law conflicts with the rest of the laws here in Michigan, and that they would be better served in the juvenile justice system. However, the bill stalled when they made it out of the House and into the Senate, stalled in the Senate Judiciary Committee. There was a hearing but no vote due to concerns by the stakeholder groups about funding and implementation for Raise the Age, and the concern that there wasn't an accurate cost estimate of what the expenses would be for the counties with this new population coming in with the law change. And so that's kind of led to where we are now, the current status of the legislation. Though we've had a lot of legislative members that have been term limited out, those who remained reintroduced their bills at the beginning of the session in the spring. We are a full-time legislature here, though there's term limits on how long you can serve. The legislature meets year-round. We were able to support the legislature in finding additional bill sponsors to take on the bills for those who were term limited out, and the bills have been referred to the House Law and Justice Committee. There has been funding for a cost study appropriated through the legislature, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and that cost study would hopefully figure out some of the estimates that the stakeholders were concerned about moving forward with, and that's due in January of 2018. Like I said, I'll talk about that more in a minute, but it really, that time, the cost study and the timing of it really dictated the timing of our campaign and how we decided to progress forward with our outreach and organizing. The committee hearings for the bills are expected at the beginning, early 2018, likely after the cost study is complete, so that the stakeholder groups will have an opportunity to review the estimates and discuss moving forward. So, speaking about legislative challenges, the main concern, as it is in most states, has been cost. Right now, the way the law works, 17-year-olds who are convicted as adults, specifically for felonies, are placed under the jurisdiction of the Michigan Department of Corrections, whether they're on probation or in a state facility or prison, and the state pays 100% for that supervision cost. While the counties still do maintain costs for housing young people in county jails or district court probation for misdemeanor offenses. For the juvenile justice system, there is the bulk of expenditures for services and programming is paid for with a 50-50 cost-sharing model between the state and the county. The county pays for the expenditures up front, and for those that are eligible for reimbursement, the state reimburses them back 50%. And so, whereas a lot of 17-year-olds are paid for 100% by the state currently, if that law change happened, there would be an additional split for their supervision once they were brought back down to the county-based juvenile justice system. There is a statute in our Constitution called the Headley Amendment that requires that any legislative changes that mandate that local jurisdictions, municipalities or counties, serve additional populations or provide a new service, that it requires that state funding pay 100% of those increased costs, and the county stakeholders are arguing that this would fall within that Headley Amendment, and it would be a violation of the Constitution unless the state paid 100% of the increased costs to juvenile courts for raise the age. In addition, additional challenges related to costs is that there's a lack of a centralized criminal justice data system that really has been posing a barrier to figuring out what the costs of raise the age are. It's difficult to know how many 17-year-olds are served by the district courts statewide. It's also difficult to know how many 17-year-olds are housed in jails, what their offenses are, how many would, while waiver still will remain a part of our justice system here, there's not a way to understand how many of those 17-year-olds county by county would remain in the adult system, how many would be transferred down. And so it's really made it difficult for juvenile court stakeholders to assess their staffing capacity to be able to successfully implement raise the age and absorb that new population of kids. Additionally, we've heard from several juvenile justice stakeholders, mostly court administrators and judges, that while their caseloads have declined, which is following the national trend, they've become more complex. They've additionally reduced their staff capacity, reduced their staffing to reflect that decrease in their caseloads, but have also implemented innovative programming and services that they're concerned that if raise the age is not funded appropriately, they wouldn't be able to provide that programming and would then have to use their funding to focus on baseline supervision costs for the new older population coming in. And another issue with the cost challenge is that while county stakeholders agree that the state should pay 100% for the cost for raise the age, there's a disagreement or variance on how that should be paid for, what the actual funding mechanism should be for raise the age. There's some people who believe that 17-year-olds should continue to be paid for, though 100%, through the same child care fund, which supports the 50-50 cost formula, while there's others who argue that it would be best if payments for 17-year-olds happened in a separate funding source outside of the existing juvenile justice caseload. So, some of the solutions. I talked about the raise the age cost study that's currently underway. Last session, around the time that the bills passed the House, actually, the legislature appropriated a nice sum of money to the Michigan Criminal Justice Policy Commission. That is the governor-appointed commission to look at criminal justice issues, to do a study to determine what the costs and savings would be both to the state and the counties associated with raise the age. So the savings to the state for not having them 17-year-olds placed and young people under the age of 18 in general in adult prisons, the savings to the counties for likewise for not having them in adult jails, but then the additional cost on the counties and the state for placing them 17-year-olds back into the juvenile justice system. The cost study will hopefully achieve the goal of going county by county and getting a concrete understanding of what the cost estimates would likely be. For Michigan's most populous counties, the researchers who, it's a firm called Hornby Zeller who actually did the cost study, the raise age cost study in Connecticut, I believe. They will do a deep dive into Michigan's 4 most populous counties and look at files, records, budgets for the juvenile courts, the district courts, the jails, and so on, to come up with individual cost estimates for those 4 counties, which have almost half of the kids we're talking about. And then for the other 79 counties, they've split those counties up into population groups. So let's say that there's, I think, about 5 county groups split up by population. They will come up, they will do deep dives into about 2 or 3 of those counties and then come up with cost estimates for those groups. That, of course, wouldn't be the final estimate for each individual county, but it could serve as a baseline for appropriations and to figure out funding. And again, as I said, the cost study, there's a rough draft that is expected to be submitted to the CJ Policy Commission in December, and then a final draft which would be made public in January next year. The second solution is we have been working with one of the bill sponsors to then collaborate with the president of the Michigan probate judges here to co-chair a work group to actually determine what the raise age funding mechanism would be. The funding task force plans to include folks representing the various county stakeholders, the prosecutors, sheriffs, judges, juvenile court, the counties themselves, and so on, folks from state government, legislators, the state budget office, folks from the executive branch, advocates like myself and others. And then we worked hard to get the House and Senate appropriations chairs from Corrections and Health and Human Services to commit to participate in the task force or the work group, and since we were successful in doing that, all four plan to participate. The first task force meeting is expected in December of this year, I believe the first week of December. The second challenge that we really are dealing with is just that they're overall, though we're very passionate and our supporters are very passionate about this issue, there's a lack of urgency amongst the state and local government about this issue. Right now, we know that this is not a legislative priority for either the governor's office or the state legislature, either chamber. They've been much more focused on auto insurance and issues like that, fixing the roads. They've already appropriated funds for the Flint water crisis, so we're coming up behind that and trying to build support and making this a priority for our issue amongst other things that the legislature is focusing on. In addition to that, there's huge potential seat changes in both chambers next year with the upcoming 2018 elections, and a lot of the legislators are already in campaign mode, and many of them have expressed awareness to upset other stakeholder groups, particularly the counties, by being strong vocal supporters of Raise the Age. And so we've had to work with those legislators to try to keep them on board, help to ease their concerns in their particular districts, to make sure that they are still on board and supportive of this issue, including the bill sponsors. And the fact that Raise the Age would provide better outcomes for kids that are involved with the justice system and produce long-term savings both for the state and the counties, it's often drowned out, try as we might, by the concerns about the upfront costs with implementation. So to address that, we are really focusing, especially since we had so much time understanding that the legislation really wouldn't move until the cost study was complete. We've really focused our time on outreach and organizing and engaging stakeholders that we'd benefit from having a boosted support from. So at every event we do, in all of our campaign newsletters to supporters, we've been encouraging to contact state legislators, their state legislators, and then encourage the Law and Justice Committee to hold a hearing on the Youth and Prison Bill package, which is the title that the legislators like to call it. We've also asked folks to encourage their county commissioners to support Raise the Age. Often when we hear from county stakeholders, they really view this, even though they see this as the right thing to do or understand it morally, they feel that they are stewards of their county budgets and do not want to put any additional costs on their residents without having appropriate funding from the state. And so we're asking the supporters to push their county commissioners advocating for passing this legislation, and also asking them to advocate for passing county resolutions supporting Raise the Age. There's a group of young people in Washtenaw County, which is where Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan is, that actually put forth a resolution supporting Raise the Age in Washtenaw County tonight. And they're actually voting on it today, this evening. And with the overall goal of county commissioners understanding that this is a change that their residents actually want them to make, that they do have the support of their residents to, and that it's okay for them to support this legislative change. Then additionally, we're always seeking stories and involving people who have been impacted by the current law, to be able to share their story and show how this has impacted them, share their experience with decision makers so that they understand the human face of this issue, and do it in a way that empowers the folks to share their voice, and do it in an authentic manner rather than just sharing their story almost as a sympathy point. My organization, MCCD, with the goal of trying to further engage county stakeholders and building support amongst the stakeholder groups for Raise the Age, we conducted 6 regional focus groups statewide with juvenile court administrators at their request, representing about 30 counties to better understand what their implementation concerns were with Raise the Age. And I felt like those conversations were really informative. Everyone came into the conversations really trying to come up with not only their concerns but specific solutions to them. And we were able to really see that there are different, because this is a decentralized county-based system, there are different issues with this legislative change that would impact counties in various ways. But we felt like that conversation allowed the counties, or at least their court administrators, to feel like their voice was heard. And I honestly can say that I feel like there's been a shift in the sentiment and the support for this issue. And additionally, the Raise the Age campaign, we've been expanding our outreach and engagement to non-traditional partners to try to expand the amount of voices on this issue. And that includes faith-based organizations, stakeholders from the field of public health, and then business communities. And additionally, all of our communication strategy, or our communication strategy, includes messaging in all of our materials, our talking points, our presentations that should appeal to various audiences, both liberal, conservative, faith-based, and business communities. And we're also preparing ourselves to respond to whatever the results of the cost study is. So we're hoping that with this strategy, with the increased partnership we're having statewide, that we will have the support we need in the communities to push their counties, and then in turn the state legislature to support passing the bills. But we'll see how things turn out once the cost study is actually released. I feel optimistic, though. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. That was really a wonderful presentation. I think that the challenges that you're facing of dealing with the counties, dealing with costs, and legislators having other priorities are things that are really going to be familiar to a lot of our audience. So thank you for that. Next, we're going to hear from Tracy Tucker, who is the Raise the Age South Carolina campaign coordinator for the Campaign for Youth Justice. Tracy has worked on juvenile justice reform in South Carolina for the past 4 years, and is a 2015 National Juvenile Justice Network Youth Justice Leadership Fellow. She holds a Bachelor of Education from the University of Georgia and a Master of Social Work and a JD from the University of South Carolina. South Carolina passed its law in June 2016 and is scheduled to be implemented in July 2019. So Tracy is going to talk about what is happening in South Carolina. And we'll transfer the microphone to her. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you, Josh. And thanks everyone for joining us on the webinar today. So in South Carolina, the Raise the Age legislation passed pretty quickly due to the efforts of our bill sponsor, Senator Gerald Malloy. It said that he attended a conference on Raise the Age and just really became passionate about it and set it as one of his priorities for the legislative session. And so then in 2016, both houses of our state legislature unanimously passed, and then Governor Nikki Haley signed our Raise the Age bill into law. And so our Raise the Age law raises the age of juvenile court jurisdiction from 17 to 18 in South Carolina, so that then all 17-year-old arrests will now fall under family court jurisdiction. Our law covers what in our state are E and F level felonies and misdemeanors. And so our law is set to become effective in July of 2019. But we have this sort of caveat in our law that it is contingent upon the Department of Juvenile Justice having received any funds that may be necessary for implementation. So what the law also did was it sort of tasked the impacted agencies with submitting data and impact reports to our Court of Administration by September of 2017 with information on sort of what the impact on those agencies would be. And those agencies were the Department of Juvenile Justice, our Probation, Pardon and Parole, the Commission on Indigent Defense, Department of Corrections. So, all right, so advocates and stakeholders in South Carolina just really viewed our Raise the Age legislation as an opportunity to kind of look at reforming our juvenile justice system as a whole in South Carolina. Because in South Carolina, we do have a large number of young people who are referred to the Department of Juvenile Justice for status offenses. And so of the 15,000, just over 15,000 or so referrals to our Department of Juvenile Justice in 2016, just over 14,000 of those, or 92% of those, were for nonviolent offenses. And then additionally, with regard to some of our 17-year-old arrests, they're also, the data shows that they're there for relatively minor offenses. 2015, 30% of those 17-year-old arrests were alcohol and drug violations, and then another 23% of those were sort of theft-related cases. And so we recognize that all of these are behaviors that could best be addressed through community alternatives in South Carolina as opposed to incarceration. So this chart here, I can move this, shows that the number of 12 to 16-year-olds in our system. So if you see the red bar here, sort of indicates the number of 12 to 16-year-olds in our system through these years. And then the blue bars represent what adding the number of 17-year-old arrests would be to the impact on the system. And so looking at this chart, it indicates to us that our DJJ has the capacity to sort of meet the impact of adding 17-year-olds to the system without building new facilities. Additionally, there was a fiscal report that was released back in December of 2016, and in that report, the Department of Juvenile Justice did anticipate that they would need additional $10 million for a new facility, and then another $5 million sort of reoccurring costs for the cost of implementation of Raise the Age. And so what I have on the right side of my screen here is some information that was obtained from the court administration report. As I indicated earlier, those agencies were sort of tasked with submitting data and sort of putting this impact report together to the Court of Administration. So we kind of thought that this report would sort of include more details about a plan for implementation and the fiscal impact, but it really sort of only ended up being a sort of a spreadsheet of the data of 17-year-old arrests from fiscal year 2016 to 2017. And so this is a chart here that just sort of helps to prove our point on the impact, because as you can see that the majority of these 17-year-olds were for misdemeanors, which are low-level misdemeanors again. So based on all of this information about our system, we formed a coalition here in South Carolina to sort of address implementation of Raise the Age, and with a focus on really being therapeutic and focusing on a continuum of community-based programs as opposed to our DJJ facilities. And so these are our principles here, and then some of our coalition members I just have listed there. And I wanted to just kind of go on to tell you about, so although we don't have a budget proposal from DJJ yet, there was a news report that came out earlier this summer that indicated that our juvenile justice system was sort of looking to flip-flop the placement of facilities in South Carolina. So in South Carolina, we have these evaluation centers, and I have those indicated on this little map with the little blue dots. And then we have one long-term facility in Richland County that I have indicated by the red dot here. And so the stars that I have here are sort of where they were potentially thinking of putting new facilities. So this one here in the Florence and the PD was actually mentioned in that fiscal report. And then also I just kind of heard some grumblings about Greenville, so I included that one as well. So what we believe our Department of Juvenile Justice is proposing to do is to kind of flip-flop those and create more regional long-term facilities. So then this new map just sort of shows the flip-flop, where I just sort of flip-flop the red dots. And so then we would have all these sort of regional long-term facilities, and they would send all of our evaluations to Columbia. Because what happens in South Carolina is that most young people who are referred to DJJ are committed to have an evaluation before their final court disposition. So they would kind of send all those kids to Columbia and then use these long-term facilities to kind of absorb the impact of 17-year-olds, and then also sort of create the regional facilities for our kids that would have been in the long-term facility in Columbia. So where we are right now with our coalition is we've just sort of submitted some FOIA requests to try to get the budget from DJJ to kind of find out what they're thinking about, what their proposed plan is. We've also sort of reached out to Senator Malloy to discuss sort of convening that group, a task force, a group of stakeholders, both government and advocates, to really discuss how to best implement Raise the Age. And sort of once we know a plan, then we can present alternatives and sort of focus our advocacy efforts to push back against new facilities here and to really promote the message of the continuum of well-funded community-based programs. So that's where we are in South Carolina, and I'll just hand it back to you, Josh.
Thanks so much, Tracy. You know, it's been so interesting for me to take a look at close look at the numbers in South Carolina and see how the juvenile offending has been dropping so much there, and that in spite of that, the state is still sending so many kids to detention on very low-level offenses. You know, you had that great bar graph that showed that 17-year-olds who are, you know, charged with things is overwhelmingly that Class U misdemeanor level. And it's the same thing on 16 and 15-year-olds. So it's not surprising that it's, you know, low-level offending, and it's not kids who there's any reason whatsoever ought to be locked up. And then, you know, the argument becomes, well, we can't afford this, you know, when it's already so many more kids being locked up than should be, and the capacity already exists, and an argument that needs to be made by advocates like Tracy is there's no reason that this is where you ought to be spending your money moving forward. So thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Josh.
I'm now going to introduce Abby Anderson, who's the Executive Director for the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. Abby joined the Alliance in 2004. She became Executive Director in 2008, and she has overseen campaigns to raise the age, reduce school-based arrests, and raise awareness of and action to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities. The Alliance is currently in the process of understanding how to work in true partnership with those who were system involved as youth, with parents, and with community members. Abby serves as a board member for the National Juvenile Justice Network. She's part of this panel because in 2007, Connecticut passed its Raise the Age law, raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction from 16 to 18. Connecticut utilized a two-part implementation plan. 16-year-olds were included in the juvenile system starting in January 2010, and 17-year-olds were included starting in July 2012. Abby will talk about the lessons learned from that experience and in the ensuing years. So, Abby, why don't you take over? Abby, I have your slides, but you may be on mute. I'm sorry, everyone. We seem to be having a little bit of difficulty.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Abby. Great.
Okay, there we are. How about now?
I can hear you.
Okay, so sorry about that. So it's such a pleasure and honor to be part of a panel like this, having these conversations. One of the things that has been interesting for me as I listen to Tracy and Jason talk about this is my blood pressure has been rising and rising and rising as I'm, going back and reliving all of our fights and conversations. And I just want to point out that, these conversations about the money, I'm not telling Jason and Tracy and probably anybody else on this call what you don't already know, but, those conversations about money are they're a little bit about money. They're mostly about not wanting to do things to help these kids. And how we address that issue and how we talk about the fact that our budget documents are priority documents, and we're right now spending an inordinate amount of money locking up Black and brown kids, but when we talk about doing alternative programs for Black and brown kids, everybody shies away. And that's a real challenge. It's certainly something that we're facing here in Connecticut on both issues around age of kids in the different systems and in terms of other issues. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on, but I just wanted to send along my empathy and best wishes, and I think the best news that we can give out of the story in Connecticut is that the impact of Raise the Age here is that our system shrank, and it shrank significantly and has been sustainably smaller. So I have a few slides to just sort of give you that information, but it shrank from front to back at every decision point across age groups, and that impact has actually been sustained into our adult system where the laws have not already changed. So you can see within that our delinquency referrals overall have gone down. You can see there at the bottom the implementation dates for Raise the Age for the 16 and 17-year-olds. Incidentally, when our law was originally passed in 2007, it was supposed to be a all-at-once change. So 16 and 17-year-olds were both going to go into the juvenile system as of January 1st, 2010. If you notice, that shift to July 1st, 2012 for the 17-year-olds actually, and not coincidentally, coincides with two separate budget bienniums. So the original reason that happened was to spread the cost out among two different budget cycles. It ended up actually being a really good thing because it allowed the system to absorb the 16-year-olds, recognize that, as you can see, there was a bump from 11,500 referrals to 11,900 referrals. Now, we were told the size of our system was going to double. There was a 400 kid difference. So that was not a doubling, and we were anticipating that 2012 legislative session going in to the implementation of 17-year-olds that we would have to fight tooth and nail against a repeal bill. And there was almost no conversation about it and no real significant or meaningful charges to try to repeal the changes for the 17-year-olds, because the 16-year-olds had come in and caused really so little impact that was the kinds of sky is falling things that we were hearing ahead of time. Just none of them happened. When you look at the next slide there, you can see that Juvenile Review Board referrals over the same time period have gone up quite a bit, almost doubled. In Connecticut, a Juvenile Review Board is something that's in the community. It tends to be mostly purely diversionary. So this is, instead of issuing a warrant or a referral to court, the cop can take the kid to the review board or the school instead of calling the police. And most of them fall under restorative justice practices. This was a concerted effort. It is certainly not the only diversionary thing happening in Connecticut. There are a lot of different initiatives around that topic, but it's one of the only ways we have of measuring concretely how the use of diversion has really increased in the state. And next we'll take a look at the fact that the detention center admissions have plummeted as well. Again, you can see we've got the blips around the 16 and 17-year-old implementation. You can also notice that before Raise the Age went into effect, so if you look at between 05, 06 and 08, 09, those numbers were already going down. And this is a good indication of the fact that the state had really worked on some of these issues before that. So if you look, in 2005 actually, the state passed a law to close our valid court order loophole around putting status offenders in detention for violation of court orders. And that was implemented in 2007. That has kept like 300 to 400 kids a year out of our detention. I want to mention here one of the things that the great and good Liz Ryan said to us here in Connecticut about our own organization, but that we really have taken to heart in Connecticut about the movement as a whole, which is to make sure not to build capacity around raising the age, but to use Raise the Age as a way to build overall capacity. And for us, that really meant looking at Raise the Age as an opportunity to redo our entire system. So really looking at, the entirety of the funnel. Who's coming into the system? Who shouldn't be in the system anymore? What are we doing to make sure that the kids who are in the system are getting more effective care so that they're there shorter time and they're not frequent flyers so they don't come back? On the next slide, you'll see that our CJTS, our Connecticut Juvenile Training School, which is where our secure confinement kids are held, our boys, there's a small standalone facility for girls that has seen a similar population shift to this one. And you can see that certainly the numbers did not double. They went down over time. There was that spike in 2013 to 2014. But then over time, the system has really, stopped having as many kids committed delinquent, but also there's been a lot of different decisions made by DCF around their own internal practices and policies on, revocations and who can be pulled back from parole violation admissions. And so some of the changes around who gets into the system are based on who the system thinks actually needs to be in the system or who needs to be locked up. And you can see some of these things where on some of these charts when there's spikes, it's kind of like, oh no, we've got the 16-year-olds. 16-year-olds by definition should probably be, in detention or locked up. And then after a year, people sort of calm down and realize, that the age isn't a deciding factor in and of itself. As we continue to move forward, you can see on the next slide that Tracy's face.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's certainly not a bad thing to look at all. So what we have looked at is on the adult side, right? So did this have any kind of an impact? When you look at the DOC, our Manson Youth Institution, this is a adult facility run by the Adult Department of Correction where our young people under the age of 18 are housed both pre and post trial, and you can see those numbers absolutely plummeting. We're incredibly proud of that as part of just a real impact of Raise the Age. And then I believe the next slide is the girls, showing that the number of girls had gone down as well. It was the one before, and it's fine. You can see it's gone from 265 in 0809 down to about 7 for the last couple years, which is fantastic. So I've talked a little bit about why did this happen, what was going on, and the fact that we had very intensive focus on diversion, right? People throughout the system were really looking at what can we do to keep kids out. This was involved in things like school-based arrest, and really trying to push back on school-based arrests and giving schools and school administrators other options. We have a statewide call-in, it's called 211, that provides programs and services to families in need. And through that, you can get access to an emergency mobile psychiatric services. And we really went out and talked to schools about, call 211 versus 911. If you're having an issue, it might be mental health related, it might not be public safety related, and try to make some of those changes happen. We also had a legislatively mandated oversight body as part of our original legislation in 2007 that went through, and I think it ended at about 2014. And we actually have another one that came up in legislation and has been operating for about another 3 years, even though Raise the Age is over. And the reason that has happened is because it brought all of the stakeholders into the room to have these conversations and hash these things out. And it ended up with things like, when we were having conversations about costs, the different agencies had to bring their spreadsheets to the table and say, well, no, we need, how many millions of dollars, and this is how we would spend them. And really had to show their work, frankly, and defend and talk about it. And it made for checks and balances because advocates were in those rooms as well. And it also meant that we were able to form alliances and relationships, right? I was just talking to somebody from the judicial branch today, and we were remembering how when Raise the Age happened here, the judicial branch had laid out a very strong case of what funding it needed, how many probation officers it was going to need, what programs it was going to need, and we were up as advocates, some of the loudest people speaking for that, because when we knew what was going on, who needed it, and that we really trusted what the money was going to be used for, we were more than happy to be some of the loudest voices speaking on behalf of those funding streams coming through. There's also been a lot of data collection and transparency. So there has been monitoring and looking at these issues. And when you start putting numbers out there and when you start showing people what they are achieving, Connecticut got a lot of national attention when it raised its age and when Raise the Age started to be implemented. And we had a lot of folks in leadership positions around the state, our commissioners of the Department of Children and Families, our chief judges, our prosecutors, our public defenders, that went out, some of our legislative champions speaking at national conferences. And people in positions of power tend to not have tiny egos, and so when they can get some strokes and they can get noticed, and when you have the data out there on a regular basis letting people know, wow, look how many percentage points this has gone down again, you're doing a great job, that has really helped. And then there's that extra bullet point there that is meaningless, and I apologize about that. So what is next? Josh, if you can actually go to the next slide really quickly, we'll show people the fact that at the chart at the bottom of the next slide actually shows that in the adult system, Raise the Age has had an effect even on the adult system, in the fact that our younger adult prisoners, so those 18 to 21, and then I think it's 21 to 29, those populations within our adult system have actually decreased quite significantly as well. And it's one of the things that our governor has looked at in terms of trying to raise the age to 21. That is one of the things on our plates here in Connecticut. Our Connecticut Juvenile Training School is scheduled to close July 1st, 2018. We're in the process of working with folks here to determine what the array of services looks like. We know that not every kid in our training school now really needs to be securely confined, so we're trying to figure out what actual needs are there and how do we work in collaboration to make sure that we have the right array of programs and services. And for those kids who are truly a risk to public safety and need to be out of the community and securely confined, we have small non-institutional therapeutic environments for that. We're also looking at removing all transferred youth under the age of 18 from our adult facilities. That's something we have not been able to achieve yet. And both of those issues, so this is why my blood pressure went up. We're getting these money arguments again. Like, you know, the training school in 2015 cost $53 million to run. The population having gone down so much, it's down to about $25 million this year, and not a dime of that was reinvested. Instead, it went right back into our general fund. You know, there was unanimous consent and voting from this legislative oversight body this year about recommending that all youth under 18 get out of our adult facility. And then it got stripped from legislation because it had a fiscal note. And we actually had that conversation on the floor saying, you're saying that we know what best practice is. We know what's best for public safety. We know what's best for young people, but we're not going to do it because it's expensive. And that's hugely problematic. So we're taking a look at what does it mean to raise the age. Does it mean that everything that is the same, everything would be the same for a 19 or 20-year-old as it would be for a 16-year-old? Does it mean there's some sort of a almost like a system that's somewhere in between, right? What the juvenile system is and what the adult system is. Some of the protections that you get in the juvenile system, and we've sort of talked about it as how can we find a way to undo some of the most nefarious outcomes of adult system involvement, right? Lifetime, you know, having that be on your record forever, and job opportunity and housing and educational opportunity impact. So that's sort of where we're going. Connecticut is in a huge budget crisis. You know, we just finally got a budget last week, and it's going to be a challenge moving forward. One of the things that the Alliance in our state as a whole, you know, we talked about how one of the ways Raise the Age was able to go forward is because we had this legislatively mandated body and that the stakeholders that were at the table, those from the affected communities, formerly incarcerated young people, were not at that table, and that was you know, a problem and an oversight, and it's something that we're working on trying to correct right now, both as an organization and as a state, looking at what it means to get those voices prominently in partnership at the table and as part of the conversation. So we'll see where that goes. But again, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this.
Well, Abby, thank you so much, and thank you also to Tracy and Jason also, and to just this huge audience that we have. We do have some time for questions. I think we can run a little bit past 2 o'clock without a big problems, and we are in fact getting some questions in. You're able to submit them. And I'll just read off the first one that I have here. And it's sort of following up on something that I think Jason had said. He was talking about how there's legislative priorities elsewhere, that members may be interested in something else. And so I'm curious for each of our 3 panelists, how well do you think that the average member understands the very basics of this issue? And so how much time do you spend in your advocacy on really like basic education about the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system? So Jason, why don't you go first, and then Tracy, and then Abby?
I would say that baseline education makes up the bulk of my conversations with legislators, especially if it's that initial conversation with a legislator or someone who we're hoping to become a bill sponsor or get their support. There really needs to be in-depth baseline conversation about how criminal justice and juvenile justice works in our state. The Child Care Fund formula for juvenile justice is really complex. It's even an ongoing learning thing for me myself. But for legislators that are term limited out, within 6 years in the House and a little bit longer for the Senate, we have turnover often here, and so it's a constant education effort. And part of the reason we want to try to pass the bills one time, the first go around, so that we don't have to do it again often. But we do spend a lot of time doing baseline education for a lot of legislators who don't necessarily, for the bulk of them, even those that are on criminal justice related committees, have that criminal justice or juvenile justice background. We do a lot of that kind of baseline education for them.
Mm-hmm. Tracy or Abby, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, in South Carolina, Josh, our conversations have really been around the community-based alternatives. So, our education is really in trying to sort of create the shift that, the behaviors that sort of tend our young people up in the juvenile justice systems are really issues that can be addressed in the communities and at home with their families, and that that really is the best way to sort of address those issues. And so that's what a lot of our conversations here have been.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that it's two-pronged, right? It's a both and of educating the legislators themselves and then educating the constituents so that they are also making their legislators aware and backing up that the legislators know that the people who vote for or against them care about this issue. We have a JJ 101 meeting with the senator tomorrow. I would say that we have tried to focus that educational effort within committees. So in Connecticut, we have joint committees, House and Senate. So the Judiciary Committee has been our big area. It has been, I would say a huge portion of what we do just generally is educating people in the community, people in the legislature, but also making sure that that we're communicating on a regular basis all of the things that we care about, and then figuring out how we can get that across. I will tell you that one of our legislative champions has said to me, give people one piece of paper and it can have a maximum of 5 bullet points on it with 5 words each, but that's max. Better is 3 bullet points of 5 words each. So we try to figure out how can you distill these incredibly complex issues into like 3 to 7 words.
Thanks to all of you. So we're past 2 o'clock, and I'd just like to let you each get the last word in on one, I think, terrific question. Having talked with each of you about this, I'm curious about you telling our audience about the role of impacted communities in your advocacy. How important is it to talk about and have impacted communities speak for themselves? So let's just kind of go in the same order again of Jason, Tracy, and Abby. And we'll leave off there about the role of impacted communities.
I think it's very important. Here in Michigan, we have a huge part of our state is very rural or and also conservative. And while we don't want this issue to be viewed as something that does not pertain to them, that's why we make sure that our spokespeople are diverse. And that there are people that represent this issue statewide. We also don't shy away from the fact that disproportionately the kids that enter the adult system are from disenfranchised communities or communities of color. And it's important for me, as a person of color, but also as a juvenile justice advocate, that their voice is lifted and empowered, and they have equal footing in influencing the policy discussion. And whenever we have that opportunity to do so, we make sure that happens. We invite people to testify in committees from impacted communities. We invite at every panel that I've done, is particularly around Youth Justice Awareness Month last month. We've had folks that have been impacted by this law share their experience with the general public. And also bring people during legislative days to meet with legislators from representing their community and outside of it. So again, we want to make sure that this is viewed as a statewide issue impacting communities all across Michigan, but don't shy away from the fact that this impacts some communities disproportionately more so than others.
Good point.
Yes, Josh. Here in South Carolina, in our coalition, we're new and reaching out with impacted communities, and so most recently, I've had the opportunity to kind of identify some youth that have been impacted, and we've been able to kind of get some art projects and things going. And so we're very hopeful that we'll be able to sort of identify a good group of folks that we can engage into the process and have them to be able to share their stories and to have that make some impact with our legislature here. So again, we recognize that their voices are key to the discussions, and that is a key point of our coalition efforts at the present time.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would say in Connecticut, we did a pretty decent job, not stellar, but a decent job during the campaign to raise the age here of including impacted communities. We made a couple of short films that included parents of young people who had been in the tried as adults at 16 or 17, and had them as part of some of our planning and rallies and events and speakers. Once we moved into the implementation stage, where things got really complicated, we really struggled with figuring out what it looks like to do that work and make sure that parent and affected communities are at those policy-making tables. And we really didn't figure that out, but we're in the process now. Over the past year and a half, we've really been looking at that and looking how we change our structure and work, and how we push the work of that, as I said, that legislatively mandated oversight committee. We've been working with the staff of that committee. They're trying to figure out too what it really means to work in partnership. Just making sure that a formerly incarcerated young person gets appointed to that table isn't enough. And it might not even be the right move. Maybe it will end up being, but making sure that voices are truly leading the conversation and leading folks like myself and those of us at the Alliance need to make sure that when we're advocating for something, it is something that the communities and those who are affected have told us they actually want us to work on. And so we have a cadre of, they have deemed themselves justice advisors. They're mostly in their 20s now, and they're doing some recruiting and out there, and they're, like I said, we're learning a lot right now. As a recovering perfectionist type A personality, not knowing what the plan is going forward is driving me a little bit out of my gourd, but it is certainly an important process, and if I'm going to go around the bend, this is a good reason to do it.
Well, listen, I really have to thank our panelists for both for their struggles in getting to this point and for being willing to talk about how they've overcome those struggles. I appreciate our huge audience today and the questions that you sent in. I think this is a wonderful experience. If you want to follow up with me, Josh Rovner at the Sentencing Project, I'm easy enough to find on our website, and any of our panelists who shared their information earlier. So thank you for a great day. I hope that everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I'm sure that we will all work together soon. All the best.